Welcome students to this edition of Mass Communication and Video Production. Today we are going to look at a newspaper with special emphasis on its front page. So we are analyzing a newspaper as we know it, but we will also look at how important is the front page of a newspaper. What is a newspaper? We all know what a newspaper is because we pick it up every morning because that is something which is integral to our lives. But even though we know what is a newspaper, but it might be also useful when we are studying the science of newspaper to know the formal definition of a newspaper. So newspaper can be explained or defined as a printed media which is usually distributed on a weekly basis or on a daily basis in the form of a folded book of papers. The publication is sectioned off. Sectioned off means it is broken up into different sections according to subject and content. The most important or the interesting news will be displayed on the front page of the newspaper. But obviously space is restricted, so not all news can be taken into the front page, or as technically front page is called page 1. Page 1 cannot hold all news. But what we try to do is, as a newspaper editor would try to put in the most important news or the news which is developing or a flash news or a sudden incident of global or national importance on the front page. Newspapers also contain advertisements, opinions, entertainment, and other general news. So, a newspaper, as we understand it or as we are studying it, contains four or has to meet four criteria. These four criteria are publicity, because it is accessible to the public. It obviously goes for publicity. Second is periodicity. It is published at regular intervals. It could be a daily, it could be a weekly. Currency, because it is current in the sense it is up to date, it is absolutely fresh, so that is currency. And the universality, it covers a whole lot of topics, which is why it is universal in nature. Every country generally has a national newspaper. Now, what is a national newspaper? A national newspaper, as we understand, is it circulates throughout the country and is not confined to any particular location or does not serve any particular region. India has a few very important national newspapers. They are the Times of India, the Hindustan Times, the Indian Express, the Statesman. Very important national newspapers in the United Kingdom are The Guardian, the Daily Telegraph, The Times, The Independent, The Observer, and even the Evening Standard, which comes out in 3 editions actually. There are national newspapers in the US, the New York Times and the Washington Post, as well as the USA Today. And there is something called the Wall Street Journal, but that generally deals with the business side of the news. There are also some papers which are more international in nature. One example is the International Herald Tribune, which would actually concentrate more on the expatriate population of the country and serve stories or present stories which would be interesting to the expatriate population of the country. There are newspapers which cover all topics. There are the local news, the local entertainment, the sports news, financial matters, international events of importance. What is very important in a newspaper is we have something called the zoning and the editioning of a newspaper. Now, what is a zoning? Zoning occurs when advertising and editorial content change to reflect the location to which the product is delivered. The editorial content often may change merely to reflect changes in advertising, the quantity and layout of which affects the space available for editorial or may contain region-specific news. In rare instances, the advertising may not change from one zone to another, but there will be different region-specific editorial content. So, say a newspaper which comes out from Calcutta is also coming out from Assam or Bihar. Because the ad positions are changing, sometimes the editorial content also changes. Now, that is called zoning and editioning. Editioning occurs also in the main sections as news is updated throughout the night, or as long as till the last moment when the newspaper is printed, goes for printing or goes for press. The advertising is usually the same in each edition, except when in some regions advertisings can change, but advertising is usually the same. Now, these editions are produced in a linear basis, and one completed edition being copied and updated is always kept for the next edition. The previous edition is always copied to maintain a newspaper of record and to fall back on if a quick correction is needed for the press. A newspaper also, interestingly, has various forms. In the sense, there are something like the broadsheets. Now, this is a broadsheet. What we understand from the Sunday Times or Times of India or even Telegraph. These are newspapers of national importance, but these are broadsheets. Broadsheets are considered the most serious press or the quality newspapers because of the large format and the serious content of news. The other form of newspaper is the tabloid, which is the half size of the newspaper, which would be, which would look something like this. This would be the shape, the size of a tabloid. So the tabloids are essentially mass entertainment products, as evidenced by the fact that they are smaller than the other papers and have larger illustrations, bold captions, and a sensational prose style. The third form, which is also getting very popular around the world, is the Berliner or the Midi form. Now, the Berliner format is a size that forms somewhere between the broadsheet and the tabloid. So, it is kind of a medium thing between the broadsheet and the tabloid. And it is also often called the Midi, that's why. And some of the famous Berliners around the world are the Guardian and the Observer in the UK, Le Monde in France, and Gulf News in Dubai. Newspapers are usually printed on cheap off-white paper known as newsprint. Since the 1980s, the newspaper industry has largely moved away from lower quality letterpress printing to higher quality, full color process offset printing. In addition, desktop computers, word processing software, graphic software, digital cameras, and digital pre-press and typesetting technologies have revolutionized the newspaper production process. These technologies have enabled newspapers to publish color photographs and graphics, as well as innovative layouts and better design. What is very important in a newspaper production or a newspaper house or for a newspaper to survive is the word called circulation. Now, circulation is something which denotes the number of copies, the number of newspaper copies that have been sold. It is called the paper circulation and is one of the principal factors used to set the advertising rates of the paper. Circulation is not necessarily the same as copies sold, since some copies or newspapers are distributed without any cost. And even readership figures cannot be understood by circulation for the simple reason that one newspaper is not usually read by one person. One newspaper can be read by 5 persons. So circulation of a newspaper cannot always determine the readership figure, but it gives a fair idea. Advertisement revenue. Now, that is also one of the most important things of any newspaper. A newspaper cannot survive without proper advertisement because that is the financial support it gets. A newspaper typically generates something like 70 to 80% of its revenue from advertising and the remainder from sales and subscriptions. Now, the portion of the newspaper that is not advertising is called the editorial content, which is these pages are all editorial content because they don't contain any advertisement. There is advertisement on the bottom of the page, these 2 advertisements. Rest of the page is all editorial content. So this is called editorial content. This is called advertising content. What is not advertising is called editorial matter. And we also use the word editorial as the editorial page or those articles with the newspapers when the guest writers or the newspaper offices themselves, they express their opinions, which is called the edit page. Now, the edit page is a very important section of the paper. This is called the main edit page of the paper because there are opinion sections, opinion columns, and there are editorials which are written by the newspaper editors because they want to express their opinion. So this is the edit page. What are the parts of a newspaper as we generally understand? Now, there are the news pages. The news pages can be broken up into region or state, nation, international, city or metro. That is basically the news pages. The editorial page, as we just looked at right now, is the opinion page. This carries the main edit pieces, which often talk of the stance of the newspaper, or it could be contributions from the guest writers. There's also something called the op-ed page, the page opposite the editorial page, which also carries information or opinion articles. Letters page, or letters to the editors section, that's a very important section which receives feedback from readers and is essential for a newspaper's growth because it is interactive. Then we have the health news, the health section, which gives us the information about latest in medical technology, together with even a doctor's column to help the readers with. We have something called the education page, which is getting more and more important these days because students and parents all need guidelines to choose careers. There's the science page, for which we are, even those who are not interested in science would also feel like reading what is the general developments happening or any specific development happening in the science world. Feature stories. Feature section is one of the most popular sections in a newspaper, which everybody reads, and it has a wide gamut of stories and articles to offer and can be on a variety of subjects, from news stories to fashion stories to celebrity profiles and any kind of human interest stories. As we have discussed before, sports stories are of course a very important section in any newspaper and would take from 3 to 4 pages of any newspaper because it is of so much of interest to the people. Human interest stories, something which are all-encompassing and something which never fails to intrigue us. Celebrity information, fashion tips. Even those who are indifferent to fashion would also check out what is the latest in fashion and go for that page. So that is also something very popular. Finance and business for the corporates and the businessmen, and also those who like to deal with the share market. They invest their money in the share market. So they would also look at this page because the share market details are given on a business page. Other parts of a newspaper which are very important are the weather report, the TV guide, and the entertainment and listing of movies and events in the city. Very, very important section which most people would look at least once because they want to know what is happening in the city, what movies they can go for, where would they go for. Entertainment features like crosswords, Sudoku, horoscopes, often the reasons for people to look into a newspaper in the first place. There are people who probably don't even look at the news but would first go for their crossword puzzle. So that is also a very important section of the newspaper. Then we have reviews of radio, movies, television, plays, restaurants. Another very popular section is the comic strips. I know it doesn't sound as important as news or features or business, but comic strips are very popular and people follow it like anything. Classified ads, weekend sections, Sunday pages, special editions. These all come as part of a newspaper. Now, just to see what are the parts of newspaper which make it important. The integral parts of a newspaper without which it is incomplete is the masthead. Now, what is the masthead? This is the masthead, right? This is the masthead. That's the name of the newspaper. So that we have a masthead. The years are that there are 2 sides of the masthead which often carry pictures or small insertions highlighting the stories in the inside pages. So these would be the years. Now, because you see the pictures, there are stories on these people. There's Dhoni, and there is another cricketer, and the main story is Narendra Modi, of course. But before that, there is Dhoni and Raina, and there are inside stories on the 2 of them. Headlines. This is the headline. And of course, the most important sections of any newspaper, because you look at the headline and then read the story. The lead of a newspaper, it comes immediately after the headline. So the lead here would be the first paragraph, which gives you the crux of the story. So this would be the lead. This comes immediately after the headline, and it serves as the introduction to the news story. In most hard news story, the lead contains the most important information. and summarizes the story. It contains the most important of the 5 W's. What are the 5 W's as we know it? Who, what, when, where, and why. And sometimes H, which is how. Deck, that's a single or a couple of lines between the lead and the main story, which is sometimes used to tell the story in a nutshell. What's a dateline? A dateline is the main thing in the beginning of the story. You have to have a dateline because dateline tells you the story date. So this is very important part of any news story, which is called the dateline. The byline is something, this is the byline, which tells you who is the person who has written the story. So this is the byline. Byline is the name of the person who has written the story. If the story is taken from an agency and the agency name is used, say AP, AFP, Reuters, any of these agencies, PTI, UNI, anything, this is called the credit line. It's not called the byline. Photo or illustration is used to further expand the story. We always need a photo. Otherwise, a story can sometimes look a little bland. Of course, if there is space in the newspaper, otherwise we can't use a story. And it's the importance of a story. This is the lead story. Now we have to have a picture. Now these stories do not have pictures, which is okay because not every story can have a picture. We need a caption for the picture, a graphic sometimes, a photo credit, which means who's the photographer who's taken the picture. Index, which is an alphabetical table of contents of the newspaper. So we know what are the contents in the newspaper on the front page so that we know where to find the stories of our interest. Jump line. Now, jump line is something which is a line which tells you the page, if the story is being continued in the inside page, the jump line tells you which page. So, continued on page 9 is called the jump line. What is the technology that is used for publishing newspapers? Of course, the first is the print. This is the printed edition, the hard copy. This is the printed edition of a newspaper. It's been printed on paper, distributed physically. If not distributed, we pick it up from a local grocery or from somewhere else. Now, there is the online version of a newspaper also, which is not a printed version. We do not get to see a printed version of that newspaper, but we can just click onto our internet on our computer or on our phone, and we get to see the whole newspaper as an online version. So now that is also getting very popular, and a lot of people are saving the printing costs and going for only online editions. Another very interesting technology of newspaper is the custom, which is a new trend in newspaper production, which is personalization through on-demand printing technologies. Customized newspaper allow the readers to create their individual newspapers through the selection of individual pages from multiple newspapers. So you have all the choices, and this is a very, very interesting choice, I think. So now we come to the front page, which is the most important page, as I told you before, and is easily the page that we need to always consult when we pick up a newspaper, because if the front page is not interesting, sometimes we don't even look at the rest of the newspaper. That also happens. We straight go to our comics and our Sudokus, probably. This is obviously the most important page, and page 1 is always... This is interesting that in a newspaper office, page 1 is the page which is released the last, because all the news pages are released, and if there is any kind of breaking news, then that goes on to page 1. Today in the electronic age, when we have television, internet and social media screaming at us the news the whole day, the wonder of picking up a newspaper to get the fresh news is somewhat jaded. Yet, a morning seems largely incomplete if we don't get to see the most important news on the front page and flip the pages through more national and international news, and then, of course, to our favorite sections, the cartoons, the crosswords, the Sudokus, and the entertainment tidbits. There are certain questions which might plague the discerning reader or a student of journalism. How much of any story is on the front page, and how much is continued in the inside pages? What makes the reader pursue the story in any another edition? It often happens that we read the story on the front page. There is a story on the Park Street case, the Park Street rape case, where it's talking about how the prosecutor defends the action, and the story is continued on page 7. So this is the jump line. Now, if you don't find the story interesting, you will probably not even go to the page 7 to read the story. So your interest has waned here. So page 1 does carry important news, but it has to hold the interest of the people also. Page 1 carries national news of importance as the lead story. Unless a story of huge international significance breaks through, like the Paris terrorist attacks recently or Prime Minister Modi's rousing welcome in the UK recently. So these would be international news which would go to page 1. Otherwise, it would usually be national news. Like this is Japan gives India nuke deal, gets support on the South China Sea. So this is an international news, but it is India-specific news also. So it is not completely an international news. But a front page is more than just stories. The responsibility of handling a page 1, as it is called, is always given to a senior and experienced journalist, and careful consideration goes into the planning, thinking, and execution of page 1. To select the lead story on page 1, which goes on top of the page, is a careful editorial decision arrived at only after editorial meetings between senior people, and very often is the editor's decision. There are very often 2 or 3 important stories which vie for attention, and only after careful debate is one selected over the others as the lead copy. The others would probably get the status of a second lead or third lead, or as decided. Now, this is the lead copy. This would be the second lead, and this would probably be the third lead. But the decision has to be taken as to what should go as the lead copy. Or here, this is definitely the lead copy, and this would be the second lead. So that is how the decisions are taken over the page 1. Typically speaking, page 1 would have a masthead announcing the name of the paper. The years along the masthead would see what is inside. Then, depending on the importance of the news of the day, will have a lead picture ideally accompanied by a lead story. Or there could also be a picture as a standalone without any connection to the real story. There would be a second lead, an anchor piece, and the page would always have an advertisement, usually across 4 columns on the right-hand side of the page, like this. 4 columns or 3 columns are on the right-hand side of the page, and this is the most important page for the newspaper, so the advertisement demand is also huge. Page 1, according to the ad support and the design of the page, also holds a number of items which are important to the readers. There could be weather forecast, in brief items on to watch out in the city, some small but important news items, and even a quick look at the share market in brief. Ideally, even when one does not have the time to go through the entire newspaper, page 1 should show the news of the day in a nutshell.